For many tabletop role-playing games, the game master and players spend the majority of their time engaged in social interactions. This is where the characters are talking to NPCs, something that is commonly referred to as role-playing. However, ironically enough, these social interactions, despite making up the vast majority of the game, are the parts of the game that many game masters prepare for the least. And I think that's understandable. Many times game masters may not be sure what they should even prepare. The other issue I see with social interactions is that we often use social interactions as a sort of combat where the characters are trying to coerce the NPCs into doing something that they probably don't want to do. Now, there is nothing wrong with this sort of social interaction. I think that social combat could be an amazingly fun part of the game. However, the issue is that we often resolve social combat with one single die roll, usually a skill check. I think there is a solid case to be made that there are some parts of the game, some types of social interactions where they're actually combat with words instead of combat with weapons, where we want to use a more robust rule set to resolve things. So today I'm going to do two things in this video. First, I'm going to discuss what a game master should prepare for an NPC that is going to be part of a social interaction in their game. Because there are various specific questions you should ask yourself as you're preparing an NPC for your game. And if you answer these questions, you're going to be able to run a much more satisfying and entertaining social interaction for both you and your players. And the second thing that I'm going to do is explain the new social combat system that my team and I created. This social combat system is something that you can use when your players are attempting to overcome an encounter with their social skills, their words, instead of their weapons. Sometimes resolving these sorts of high stakes moments with just one skill check can feel unsatisfying. And it can be very swingy because success or failure hangs on just one die roll. If they roll low, they fail. If they roll high, they might succeed. Friendly versus hostile social interactions. Now, the first thing that we need to differentiate between are friendly social interactions and hostile social interactions. A friendly social interaction is when the characters are interacting with NPCs who are either neutral or friendly, and where the character's main objective is to obtain information from the NPC, though they might also want the NPCs to do something for them. This might be your standard NPC quest giver who delivers the plot hook and additional related information. Or it might be a shopkeeper that the characters are attempting to convince into giving them better prices. A hostile social interaction is exactly what it sounds like. A social interaction with an NPC that is antagonistic toward the characters. This often involves the bad guys who the characters are, or perhaps soon will be, fighting. But it could also just be an NPC who opposes the characters for some reason. For instance, it might be a noblewoman who has it in against the party and wants to see them fail because they slighted her at the royal dinner party. How to build a friendly social interaction. Now we're going to get into the meat of it, discussing how to build these social interactions. And for our purposes here, we're going to assume that you have already created the NPC. They already have a name, a general description, an occupation, and perhaps even a secret. When you anticipate that a specific NPC is going to be involved in a friendly social interaction, these are the questions you want to ask to prepare. Probably make notes of. Bullet points. Number one, what relevant pieces of information does the NPC know? And let's put an emphasis on relevant here. Things that pertain to the campaign, an adventure at hand, or something the characters might reasonably ask the NPC about. Number two, how can the characters get the NPC to divulge what they know? And of course, the NPC might just give it freely as well. Number three, is the NPC withholding any information? And if they are, what can the characters do to uncover that additional knowledge? Number four, what can the characters do in this interaction that will change the NPC's attitude toward the players, either favorably or negatively? This is particularly useful if the NPC is neutral and the characters may attempt to get on their good side. It is also good to know what the characters might do that will cause a good relationship to sour. Now, these four questions can usually be answered in a couple sentences each. The longer and more complex the information that you create, the more difficult it's going to be to use it in a social interaction, since social interactions are usually fast-paced in terms of you needing to think and react to what your players' characters are saying. If you think that your players are likely to ask an NPC to do something for them or give them something besides information, then it is also helpful to ask some additional questions. Number 1, what will the characters likely ask the NPC to do? Number 2, what will motivate the NPC to give the characters what they want? We have all been in games where the captain of the guard asks the player's characters to help with some problem that the town is experiencing. And then one of the very first questions the players ask is for the captain of the guard to help them resolve the problem. Or they might ask for some soldiers to accompany them. Or the characters go to the market and are shopping, and one of the first things they try to do with the shopkeeper is get them to lower their prices. Now, typically there are one of two things that you can do in these situations. You could just say no, which is a perfectly fine response, frankly, even though it is probably not super satisfying unless you have a good justification. Or you could lock the affirmative response behind a skill check. The characters make a diplomacy check or an intimidation check, and then if they are successful, the NPC does or gives them the thing they're asking for. However, this can also be unsatisfying in some instances. So the third option is to consider what would motivate the NPC to give the characters what they want. For instance, if the characters are asking for a month of free room and board at the tavern, which is a fairly tall ask, the tavern owner might be willing to give it if they go on a basic quest for him. Or if they're asking the captain of the guard to help them on a quest or lend them some soldiers, they may agree to it if the characters promise to give an equal share of the treasure, and if some of the soldiers die on the quest, the treasure will go to their next of kin. Or the captain of the guard might tell them that the reason he can't spare any soldiers is that there's something else going on in town, and that if the characters first go deal with that other thing, then when they come back to him, he'll lend them some soldiers so they can go deal with the first thing he asked them to do. Or the stipulation might be that if the soldiers die on the quest, the characters bring them back from the dead. After all, there's a reason the captain of the guard is asking the characters to help with the issue and not just sending soldiers in the first place. It's likely a dangerous quest. Or if the characters are trying to get the shopkeeper to lower their prices, the shopkeeper might have a small task for them to complete. They have a rival a few blocks over who has been sabotaging their business, and they would like the characters to return the favor. So you see, when you have thought this through just a little bit, and you know what NPCs might ask in return of the characters, you can enrich the game and make things more interesting than simply saying no or asking for a skill check. By the way, if you're finding this information useful, please give me a thumbs up, share this video with a fellow game master, and subscribe to the channel. And remember, whenever you're ordering a breakfast sandwich and you have to choose between bacon and sausage, always choose bacon. How to build a hostile social interaction. I feel like sometimes we can be very intentional about friendly social interactions, but when it comes to hostile social interactions, game masters sometimes don't put a lot of thought into them. And I know that they don't put a lot of thought into them for a couple different reasons. First, there are many published modules where there are monsters listed off in a room, and those monsters don't do anything but attack. The writers don't give us any role-playing notes for those monsters. They don't tell us what the monster's motivations might be. They don't give us any information with which we might inform a social interaction between the monsters and the player's characters. This is a pet peeve of mine, and it's exactly the reason that in the publications that my team creates, we include role-playing notes for the various encounters in an adventure. Second, I have been in lots of games where game masters don't do anything but have the monsters attack. It's like you open a door, the game master describes a pack of goblins in there, and then tells you that they just all attack. There's no opportunity whatsoever to overcome that encounter with any means other than combat. So what I'm suggesting is that as game masters, we should be way more intentional about creating hostile social interactions. That is, when in our adventure there are some enemies in an area, we should also consider developing information that can help inform a social interaction. Because many times players want to talk to the enemies. They might want to use their social skills and persuasive skills or intimidation skills to overcome that encounter. Not everything has to be combat. So when you are preparing an encounter, also be prepared for that encounter to be played out via a hostile social interaction. And to do that, you want to ask the following questions. Number 1, what will the characters likely want the NPCs to do? This might be surrendering to them, giving them an object, or anything else the characters might try to compel based upon the nature of the adventure. For some hostile NPCs, there might just be one thing the characters are likely to want. For others, there might be a short list of possibilities. Number 2, for each of the things the characters are likely to want the NPCs to do, describe how the characters can make that happen. It's also acceptable to decide that there are no conditions under which that would happen. I feel like this would be rather common when a major villain is ordered to surrender to the characters. A villain is not just going to surrender. It doesn't matter if they make diplomacy checks and intimidation checks, unless of course they have an ulterior motive to surrendering, something they're planning on doing. Number 3, list out the relevant pieces of information the NPCs will know, and describe how the characters can uncover it. Some of this information might be given freely, kind of like how villains can monologue about their plans, but other pieces of information should only be available under certain conditions, such as torture after they take him captive or something, I don't know. How to run social combat. Now, the thing that almost always happens when characters try to compel an enemy to do a thing is that the game master will ask for a skill check. Diplomacy, intimidation, deception, and the like. But getting a hostile enemy to do a thing with just one skill check seems a little far-fetched at times. Like, it might work in some situations, sure, but in other situations, it's just not reasonable. So you could use a skill challenge instead, of course, and that involves a series of skill checks. So that's perhaps a little bit more satisfying and reasonable, but it essentially just means making several skill checks instead of one. And that might not be super interesting either. However, there is an alternative: social combat. And when I say social combat, I literally mean just that. It is combat that is conducted socially through words and interactions instead of with weapons. So what my team and I did is that we created a streamlined system that you can use to run social combat in your games. Now, we created versions of this for both D&D 5th edition and Pathfinder 2. What I'm gonna do right now is literally walk you through the mechanics of the system. And I'm gonna get pretty granular so that if you'd like to use the system in your games, you can. Of course, if you'd like to save yourself the hassle of taking notes while constantly pausing the video, we also have published this social combat system in Lair magazine issue 42, Society and Splendor. There's a link down below where you can pick it up for either 5th edition, Pathfinder 2, or both. Also included in that issue are 2 adventures that use the social combat system and several other resources you can use in your games. Now, social combat involves the highest stakes available in the realm of social interaction. It is a no-holds-barred, winner-take-all interaction where one side can actually compel the other in ways that they ordinarily could not in a normal social interaction. These high-stakes standoffs can have consequences just as severe as combat, with the possibility of failure lurking around the corner. The goal with a social combat is to represent something between the standard cordial discussion and a fight to the death. Any group engaged in a social interaction can declare the start of social combat. And when the social combat begins, it uses the following rules. Number 1, all creatures involved in the social combat roll initiative. Turns will play out in initiative order, but do note that turns during social combat are not limited to the standard 6 seconds. The initiative primarily exists to keep the social combat orderly. Number 2, each creature begins the day with a morale of 3 plus its proficiency bonus. A group of creatures uses a single morale value, which we will discuss a bit later. Number 3, on each turn, the creature chooses whether to make a social attack, support an ally, prepare for an incoming social attack, or use a standard action. And we'll discuss what each of those means in just a moment. Number 4, the social attack should be described or acted as something that would viably make the target creature back down. Simply declaring a roll should not be sufficient. In other words, if the rogue is good at stealth, they can't simply say that they're using stealth for a roll. They need to explain how that would actually be relevant in the social combat. Number 5, if a social attack is successful, it inflicts morale damage, reducing the target creature's morale by 1. Morale damage increases to 1d4 at level 5, 1d4 plus charisma modifier at level 10, and finally to 2d4 plus charisma modifier at level 17. A roll of a natural 20 always increases the morale damage by a flat 1 point. Number 6, a creature or group of creatures cannot use the the same action twice in a row except for making a social attack. Number 7, when a creature or group of creatures' morale is reduced to 0, it becomes frightened of the other side for 24 hours. While frightened in this way, the creature can move toward the creature it is frightened of at half its movement speed. This outcome is separate from winning or losing the social combat overall. One or more creatures or groups of creatures can be reduced to 0 morale without their side losing the entire social combat. Number 8, after the social combat ends, players can restore their morale by using hit dice during a short rest. 1 morale point per hit die expended, or by completing a long rest. And of course, for the Pathfinder 2 version, the rules are tweaked and a little bit different. Okay, now let's discuss some of the game mechanics that are specific to the social combat system. First, we have the social attack. A social attack is made using any charisma-based skill, as long as the creature can justify its use. The result of this rule must equal or exceed the target's social armor class to be successful. And that brings us to the social armor class. A creature's social armor class is equal to their choice of 10 plus the creature's wisdom insight modifier, or 10 plus the charisma intimidation modifier. Each creature must designate which option it will use at the beginning of the social combat. And at the game master's discretion, the creature can use strength intimidation in place of any charisma intimidation check. Creatures with high wisdom or charisma modifiers, 12 or above, should be assumed to be proficient with insight or intimidation for the purposes of determining their social armor class. That is, they should include their proficiency bonus when determining their social armor class. Next, we have support an ally. When supporting an ally, the creature chooses any applicable skill and rolls to determine a result. If the supported creature makes a social attack on its turn, it may choose to use the result of its supporter's roll in place of its own. And again, we have the same stipulation against applicable skills, in so much that they must make sense in the context of the situation. The next mechanic is to prepare for an incoming social attack. With this, the creature prepares itself for whatever is coming and steals its nerves. This grants it a +2 social armor class bonus until the start of its next turn. Finally, we have standard actions. These include anything on a character sheet or stat block. Depending on the action taken, social combat may devolve into standard combat. Alternatively, spellcasting bardic inspiration and other options could enhance allies as an alternative to using the support an ally action. Now, in the base social combat system, we assume that every creature involved in the combat can take its own individual actions on its initiative. However, you may want to group up NPCs or monsters. When you combine NPCs or enemies into groups, the social combat will probably move a bit faster. When in a group of 2 or more, NPCs and monsters benefit from the following group bonuses. Number 1, the group's social armor class is equal to the highest individual social armor class of the creatures in the group, and the group receives a +1 bonus to their social armor class for every 3 creatures in the group. Number 2, the group has a social attack modifier equal to the highest individual social attack modifier of the creatures in the group, and the group receives a +1 social attack bonus for every 3 creatures in the group. And number 3, the group's morale value is equal to the highest individual morale of the creatures when they start the combat. Groups of monsters have a +1 bonus to morale for every 3 group members. Okay, so we have the mechanics for conducting a social combat. However, how do you win or lose? Basically, a side loses a social combat when the morale of all its individual members or groups has been reduced to 0. Much in the same way that during normal combat, a side loses when all of its members are reduced to 0 hit points. Now, the results of winning or losing social combat differ slightly from winning or losing standard combat. First of all, nobody usually gets killed during social combat. In fact, the goal is to not even use weapons. In general, once one of the sides participating in the social combat loses, its members are compelled to retreat from the social combat and cannot initiate either physical or social combat against the winning side for 24 hours. However, the losing side may fight back if either physical or social combat is initiated against them. Now, retreating from social combat does not necessarily mean fleeing the area. The intent is that winning a social combat effectively neutralizes the threat and overcomes the challenge of the losing side. When you're designing a social combat encounter, consider what the expected outcome will be beyond just retreating. For instance, if the characters win the social combat, What do they get? Do they get something besides just not having to have a physical combat? Can they compel the creatures that lost to act in a certain way? Will the creatures that just lost give up some of their possessions? Or might they be able to just get them to flee from the area without further fighting? For example, in the level 18 adventure included in issue 42 of Lair magazine, the vampire Armand can be fought in social combat to compel him to help the characters reach the rear of a temple. Now, I certainly do not think that you should use this social combat system in every circumstance. There are certainly times when a simple skill check is all that is needed. However, if you're looking to emulate a high-stakes social interaction where something of great value hangs in the balance, this social combat system was designed to simulate just that. But that's just what I think. What do you think? How do you prepare for and run social interactions in your games? And don't forget to pick up Lair magazine number 42 if you'd like to get the written version of our social combat system. Now, if you'd like to learn how to design villains and NPCs so that they come to life in your games, check out this video right here. And until next time, happy game mastering.